Welcome to Secrets of a Murder Detective.
The murder of Yang Lu in October 2016 was one of Derbyshire and Manchester's most gruesome cases. I'm meeting with a senior investigating officer on the case to understand what really happened, the pressures, the setbacks, and the breakthrough that eventually brought the killer to justice.
This is a brutal case involving a victim who was inhumanely murdered. I'm former Detective Chief Inspector Terry Crompton of Greater Manchester Police, and I served for 30 years.
Hi, Terry. Hi, Steve. Thanks for coming in. Much appreciated.
Cheers, thank you.
Terry, the case we're going to talk about today is from October 2016. What were you doing then? What was your role?
So at the time I was a Senior Investigating Officer, Detective Chief Inspector, leading a major incident team in Greater Manchester. I was on the cover weekend when it came in. My detective superintendent approached me and said, there's a chance this incident from Derbyshire is going to come over to Manchester. I was already aware of it because I'd actually seen it on the news. I'd taken a little bit of interest because it was an unusual case, quite brutal. So the first time the police were alerted to this case was on the 10th of October 2016. That's when a call had been made from a member of the public
Emergency route service,
indicating that they'd seen something suspicious. What they discovered was a burnt torso that had been dumped in a lay-by adjacent to the A628, the Woodhead Pass, just outside of Tinswhistle on the main road between Sheffield and Manchester.
The circumstances of this case, it's certainly something I'd never seen before and I'd never seen since. My name's David Cox. I'm a former police officer within Derbyshire Constabulary. I was a senior investigating officer. The body had been deposited in the open air and it had been found by hikers who were walking in the area at the time. As this was in Derbyshire, it was my responsibility to go and attend the scene and find out the circumstances of what had taken place. I arrived at the entrance to the car park where the body had been found, and I could see straight away that it was the body of a person. I was in no doubt about that. But unusually, the head had been removed, the arms had been removed, and the lower legs had been removed as well.
The body consisted of basically just the torso. The body itself had been placed into a suitcase, and the suitcase had been set on fire.
As somebody who's investigated murders, you do find yourself seeing quite horrific sights at times, and it can be quite emotionally challenging. But as a senior investigating officer, you remain professional and you remain focused on the job that you've got to do. I couldn't tell at that stage whether it was male or female. There'd clearly been some time taken to deposit the body in the manner that it had been, and my immediate thoughts were that steps had been taken to prevent identification of the body.
To understand how a person died, you have to understand how they lived. It's also known as victimology. But when you don't know the identity of a victim, this becomes a priority. Investigators will need to understand who is this victim before they can understand why they died. The reason for that is in most murders, if you get a good understanding of a person's life, generally there's something within their life, be it some activity they partake in or a person they're associated with, can give you a clue as to why they came to harm.
Yeah.
But you've got none of that, have you?
Yeah, you've got a huge part of your investigation missing. If you can imagine, if they knew who he was, then they'd go to his flat. They'd find out a little bit about him. They'd find out who his associates were, what sort of issues he had in his background. They'd look at the CCTV around his address to see what's going on there. So those are the sort of things that you're missing if you've not got the identity of the victim from the outset.
So this would be a highly complex case for a forensic scientist. Hi, my name is Paul Langton. I was a forensic specialist. You've got an arson case, so you've possibly got petrol or some kind of accelerant present there. It's a blood case because the SIO would want to know, is this the site of the dismemberment or is this a body disposal site? But you've also got the actual suitcase itself as a very significant item. Was there any fingerprints on the suitcase? Is there zips? Is there any areas for these to be DNA swabbed? It has a multitude of forensic disciplines which need to be looked at.
So the problem with this was that it was a really rural area. It was a place where there were vast areas of fields and moorland which people could gain really easy access to by just hopping over a wall or walking up a track. So in this case, the drone was used, put a drone up in the air to try and cover a larger area. This was really critical for the investigation because if I could find the head or I could find the hands, then that would really help me with the identification. But unfortunately, at the end of it, we weren't able to find any of the remaining body parts.
So, from the sounds of it, what they've been presented with is a very difficult challenge because the fact a body's been set on fire will cause its own issues, won't it? Particularly around forensics and any links that they can create between the suspect and the victim.
Absolutely. So they had some really big issues to overcome.
So from the scene, the body is taken away. It is forensically recovered and taken away to the mortuary to ensure that any opportunity to get forensic material from the body that had helped the investigation is maintained.
So routinely, what you would have done there is to look for fingerprints on the body, but obviously because it was missing limbs, that was unable to do.
The head was missing, so it meant that things like odontology around dentistry, we couldn't do any examinations there. So we were heavily reliant on DNA.
In this case, the body had been set on fire. The actual tissue, the cells within that body, starts to deteriorate very fast. And fire would also affect the DNA on the surfaces.
There wasn't a huge amount of detail that I was given. I knew now it was a male, a rough idea of the height. On the back of the victim, there was a small postage stamp piece of skin which hadn't burned, and that told me that it was a light-skinned person, although I couldn't determine an ethnicity.
That was tested, and a full DNA profile was obtained, which was loaded to the National DNA Database, but that yielded no information, no names came back.
The forensic examination hadn't given us that breakthrough that I'd hoped for in the investigation. So what I drew from the post-mortem and the pathology was that the murderer had taken great steps to conceal the identity of the victim. And the only reason I could think that this may have taken place was that the murderer and the victim actually knew each other. And what the murderer had sought to do was break that link. One of the lines of inquiry was to examine all the available CCTV. The A628, the Woodhead Pass that goes between Sheffield and Manchester, is quite sparsely populated, and it was really difficult because the CCTV was generally quite grainy, didn't really give us a huge amount of detail on the makes and models of vehicles that were going past, let alone getting a registration number. The other line of inquiry was to look at missing people.
Clearly, because the road was between two big areas in particular, South Yorkshire, Manchester, and then in the middle, Derbyshire. So they'd be really trying to work out who'd gone missing from those areas and trying to match up that individual to those missing people.
And of course, this was a changing picture every day because every day somebody new gets reported missing and every day somebody is found and is no longer missing. So it was really difficult to keep on top of that. I'd utilised things like the local media to try and generate lines of inquiry to identify witnesses. This didn't particularly work that well. I was also convinced that this was a deposition site. What that means is the murder has taken place elsewhere, but at this time I didn't know where that was. A week after the inquiry had commenced, we were still in no better position really than we were very early on. I'm quite quickly running out of options.
In many murder investigations, police will seek out witnesses in what's known as an anniversary visit. So this could be 7 days, a month, or a year after the murder has taken place. One method that is rarely used is known as a road check. The idea behind a road check is that police will be seeking out witnesses that may have passed the scene at that exact same time.
I wanted to try and find somebody who was driving down the road at that time a week before. And I was looking for things like, did they see anybody go into the lay-by? Did they see a fire lit? Did they see any unusual activity around the site where the body was deposited? And what the anniversary event found was that we had a member of the public who had got some dash cam footage. They were going in the direction of Manchester towards Sheffield, and as their car drove past the lay-by where the body was found the following day, a fire could be seen that had been set alight in the lay-by.
This has allowed Derbyshire Police then to establish a timeline for the offence taking place. We're looking at a 2-hour window around about 11 o'clock at night. So one of the major breakthroughs that Derbyshire got was a real chance occurrence where they were made aware of the presence of a ANPR camera that was close to the scene that had been placed there sometimes before, and that was in relation to the Olympics.
Across the UK is a network of cameras known as ANPR, which stands for Automatic Number Plate Reader. These are cameras dotted around the country. Some you can see, some you can't. And they will collect the registration numbers of all cars that pass them.
Unusually, with this particular camera, we had no idea it was there. It was placed there by South Yorkshire Police in 2012. The Olympic cycle race was in the vicinity of Tintwistle and the Yorkshire Moors. Unusually, this camera had never been removed, and it had sat by the roadside. So I was really excited to find out that the camera that South Yorkshire Police had put on the A628 all those years ago was still recording, and it was still collecting data.
As a result of that, officers were dispatched to download the information. So looking at a particular window around about 11 o'clock on the 9th of October, the total number of vehicles were downloaded. There were around about 100 vehicles that passed in the particular time frame.
And I knew what I couldn't do is go and examine every single vehicle that had travelled along that road at that particular time. What I needed to do was put some prioritisation in place that helped me identify the vehicles that were most likely involved.
It's the type of road where you normally just, particularly at that time of night, would only go one way. So any vehicle that was passing that camera twice is going to be very, very interesting to the inquiry.
Once the ANPR data had been examined, there were about 2 hits that had gone into the vicinity and then returned back out.
You can imagine the excitement that they've got at that point, because that is really significant. You've got to say that what's that vehicle going out towards that isolated scene and coming back again? And, you know, you can start to think about, well, what are the next steps, where we're going to go with this?
The first one belonged to a professional person who was ruled out quite quickly, and the second vehicle was a Mercedes, and that belonged to somebody called Ming Jiang.
If police wish to search a motor vehicle looking for evidence in a murder, they'll be able to do so in one of 2 ways. Firstly, if somebody is arrested for that murder, that will open up powers to allow them to do so. But if somebody isn't arrested, they will have to apply for a search warrant by going to a magistrate's court, which will then give them the power to search and look for evidence inside that car. So the car had a registered keeper. What were the details of that?
Well, it was registered to a guy called Ming Jiang. So, again, the first things you're going to do with that is have a really good look at this individual and, you know, what's his background. He was a male that lived in Beswick in North Manchester. Interestingly, the vehicle had no insurance and no vehicle excise licence. Vehicle excise licence is otherwise known as road tax, with records being held on a national database.
As investigators, it's just a little thing that gets your senses going a little bit, isn't it? Think,
Yeah,
maybe.
absolutely. I suspect that if you look at all those other vehicles that passed through that ANPR camera, almost every one would have been completely legal.
At this point, I really had to take stock of the information that I'd got in front of me. I didn't know if they were driving it at the time, whether that vehicle had been sold on, whether it had not been registered by a new keeper. I also was lacking a little bit of information, and what I didn't want to do was find myself in a position whereby I arrested somebody but then had to release them because I didn't have my evidential case in place to take to the Crown Prosecution Service.
However, there was an opportunity because the vehicle is potentially being driven around without insurance. So the SIO decided that he would arrange for a traffic stop, and on the 19th of October, that's exactly what happened.
So I made the decision there to seek some help from Greater Manchester Police, who helped us locate the vehicle, stop the vehicle, and speak to Jiang, who was the driver at the time.
Ming Jiang wasn't arrested or made aware the stop was in relation to a murder inquiry, and at that stage was free to go.
Police took possession of that vehicle, and what that allowed me to do then was to conduct a forensic search of that vehicle to see if there was any evidence that may link it further to the offence.
So that Mercedes would have been sent to a forensic bay in a recovery garage, or directly to a forensic kind of company to look for forensic evidence. And you would have got pretty much the whole car searched for blood, using various different blood testing techniques, which will highlight an area of interest.
So in the boot of that vehicle, the scenes of crime officer found a spot of blood. It was a single spot of blood in the boot. It was about the size of a 10p piece, and a fast-track inquiry then that came out of that was to compare the blood that was in the boot of the car with the body that we found in the lay-by, because what I wanted to do was see if I could connect the body with the boot of the car.
The searching of the car would involve a forensic search to find traces, DNA, fingerprints, etc. But they'd also be looking to see what else may be in the car, any clues, indications that would assist the investigation. Was there anything else that was found there?
Yeah, there was a document found in the vehicle that had a name on it, which was the name Yang Lu. So, again, it's a different name. It's a name that's not come into the inquiry so far. So the inquiry team would want to do a little bit of work on that name, just to work out who that person was and whether or not they fit into the inquiry in any way.
So Derbyshire Police, they now need to understand, where do these two people fit into this inquiry? Are they the victim? Are they suspects? Or are they totally uninvolved? You have to keep an open mind, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't know how many people are involved, and you've got to keep everything as open as possible. You know, your job is not to convict someone, it's to establish the truth. From the process point of view, Ming Jiang is looking very interesting, but in terms of Yang Lu, there's obviously got a little bit of work to do on him. Who is he? Where does he live? What's his background? Is there any links between him and Jiang? You know, where is he? Ming Jiang was 43 years old. He'd come to the UK from China as a student and has since worked at a number of jobs, including as an air steward and a restaurateur. He was known to the police to a very small extent, but he had no serious previous convictions. We then looked into Yang Lu's background. Yang Lu is 36 years of age. He came to the UK from China in 2000. He studied at Leeds University and eventually became a naturalised UK subject in 2013. He lives in a nice apartment in a lovely area of Manchester and Salford Quays around Media City, and he spends his time making money through the stock market. Yang Lu had a few friends, but he was quite a solitary figure in some ways, but he enjoyed occasional meals, going out. Both him and Ming Jiang were acquaintances. They weren't good friends, but they would spend time having a meal together from time to time, and also spent some time in the casino together.
So by this time, it was about 10 days into the investigation. It was a huge thing for me. We'd laboured over this inquiry for a number of days. We'd had so many dead ends and things that hadn't worked out for us. But then the hit came back on the DNA. Blood that was in the boot of the car with the body that we found in the lay-by. That came back positive. So what that told me was that the body had been in the boot of that particular vehicle. and that was the single biggest breakthrough in this investigation.
And also the tyres themselves were examined, and that resulted in an exact match between the Mercedes B-Class and tracks left at the scene. So at that point, Ming Jiang is declared a suspect, and a warrant is obtained for his home address in Beswick. Officers then go to conduct the warrant. Ming Jiang isn't present. They force entry into the premises and then start an initial search. The search of the apartment came 10 days after the body was found.
I sought some help from our colleagues in Greater Manchester Police, and a short time later he was located at a casino in the city.
And he's then arrested for the murder and taken back into custody in Buxton in Derbyshire. The case is still with Derbyshire Police, but Greater Manchester Police are now assisting with the investigation.
And at the time he was arrested, he had documentation for Yang Lu in his possession. He had a passport, and he also had Yang Lu's mobile phone with him.
Why has he got his identity documents with him? Why is he carrying his mobile phone? Bearing in mind that we've got a body that we've been unable to identify, the question is this our victim?
If a suspect is being interviewed at a police station in relation to a murder, and they speak and they give an account, that will need to be explored. The police will need to understand, is what we're being told the truth, or is it a pack of lies? So, having arrested Ming Jiang, they would have taken him to the police station and he would have been interviewed, and it would have been his opportunity to give any account that he chose to do. What happened there?
Well, what you're frequently faced with in murder cases is people saying nothing and going no reply. Now, Ming Jiang took the decision to talk, and through most of the inquiry, he gave explanations.
He was very calm in the interviews, didn't seem to have any huge amount of concern for the situation that he was in, and didn't really have any regard for the police.
He initially explained that on the night of the 9th of October, the night of the deposition, that he was on his way over to Sheffield in order to take part in a poker game, and that his engine management light had come on. He had to stop. He said he got out for a brief period of time, got back in the vehicle, and then headed back.
One of the accounts that Jiang gave in an interview was that he was in a relationship with Yang Lu, that he'd not seen him for a few days, and that he wanted to report him missing because he was concerned about his welfare.
So by that stage, he was in the process of being interviewed, and they'd obtained a warrant in order to go to his home address.
There's two things that we're looking for here. We're looking for any physical evidence that may link Jiang to the offence. So were there similar types of suitcase in this particular apartment? Was there blood, fingerprints, hair, samples? When you walked into the apartment, it looked clean and tidy, as if nothing particularly remarkable had taken place. But when the forensic officers went in there and they used their expertise and their examination techniques to try and find that evidence, it was there in abundance.
So even if you deep clean a property, it still provides lots of opportunities for a forensic scientist. You may believe you're getting rid of evidence, but the test which we have still gives us plenty of opportunities to search that scene. So one of the tests we have in our kind of toolbox is a test called luminol. And luminol is a very, very sensitive technique and test for blood. If you had 1 part blood and 50,000 part water, it's that sensitive, and that it's be able to identify that.
There was blood that had seeped between the cracks on the laminate flooring. There was blood on the ceiling that had been painted over, and it went from the ceiling down to the skirting board. There was a huge amount there.
In this case, we had blood on the ceiling. So that almost certainly was caused by the dispatch of blood from a weapon that would have been cast from that weapon onto the ceiling. So it was clear that something very serious had happened in the vicinity. One of the big things they noticed was that the settee So for all intents and purposes, the settee was just like any normal settee that anyone would have in their house. But once you took the covers off, the cushions underneath were absolutely sodden in and soaked in blood. When we looked in the bathroom, there were clearly areas of blood that had been diluted. So the inference from that is either someone's washing up afterwards, or alternatively that the dismemberment of the body took place at that location.
We found a set of aluminium ladders which were by the bins. These were covered in blood as well, and it led me to the belief that they'd somehow been used in the murder, perhaps to transport the body, used as a type of stretcher.
Going into his flat and then finding the blood, that's a game changer, isn't it?
It is, but actually at that stage we still don't know who the victim was.
I sent officers straight round to Yang Lu's apartment because I wanted to understand the role that this person had played. I just didn't know who this person was. When the officers arrived at Yang Lu's apartment, they knocked on the door. They didn't get an answer. Officers forced entry to this apartment. It was unoccupied at the time.
They're faced with quite an unusual environment. They found that the flat was almost empty of all items, even absence of clothing. We just don't know enough about Yang Lu and his movements to say whether or not this is normal or otherwise. But what we've got here is something interesting.
I decided to take some items which we will be able to compare the DNA on with all the other DNA that we'd recovered in the investigation. So took a toothbrush.
So the item of DNA recovered from Yang Lu's address demonstrated that we had a categorical identification that the torso that had been dumped in the lay-by was actually Yang Lu. So when Ming Jiang was challenged and confronted with the evidence, they started to create another explanation. And this time he talks about a mysterious figure called John Wong.
There was a gangster by the name of John Wong who'd been involved in the murder. He also gave some information about a Malaysian betting syndicate, and somehow they were involved in this as well.
He also started to make assertions about Yang Lu, explaining that he was involved in an escort business and that Yang Lu had gone off with an older man.
We were very dubious about this because what we did know was that Yang Lu was from a wealthy family. There was nothing that suggests that he might have to engage in those sort of activities to try and make money for himself.
So when people watch TV programmes or films about police interviews, they might get mistaken the style of these interviews and how they take place, but they're very conversational.
Yeah.
And they go into an awful lot of detail. And if you're lying and you haven't thought about that detail, that's where a story can start to unravel.
Yeah, and it did in this case. The interview for Ming Jiang was an absolute disaster. He would have been far better not saying anything in those circumstances, but he obviously had the confidence to feel that he could talk his way out of it.
Forensic examination of a crime scene, particularly one where a violent attack has taken place, can take quite some time, can't it? It can be days and potentially even a number of weeks. What were you getting from Jiang's flat around the forensic examination?
The golden pieces of evidence that you always want to get, that magical evidence really, is fingerprints in blood.
When police search a crime scene looking for forensic evidence, linking a suspect to a crime scene, linking them to the murder, there's one piece of evidence I call the Holy Grail, and that is a fingerprint in blood. And the reason for that is that not only does it place that person with their unique fingerprint at a crime scene, by the fact it's in blood, in victim's blood, means that that fingerprint could only have been put there after the victim bled.
So despite the clean-up that's been taking place, on the underside of a table was a fingerprint in blood. So the fingerprint belonged to Ming Jiang and the blood belonged to Yang Lu. Do you think about a jury, what they're going to think of that and how important that is? It's absolutely vital. It was clear for both the murder and the dismemberment had taken place in a flat in Beswick in Manchester, which meant that it was time to do the handover to Manchester. And I took over as the senior investigating officer from Dave Cox from Derbyshire Police. We were 17 days after this offence had taken place. So if you imagine what's happened in those 17 days, the offender's got a big head start on you. He's been covering his tracks. So we have already lost quite a significant amount of evidence in that period because of what he's done.
What was the family liaison situation around Yang Lu, and where were his family? Were they in the UK or were they back in China? Where were they?
Well, this was, again, a little bit unusual because his family were all in Beijing in China. So I had to get in touch with Interpol and go through the authorities in order to notify the family through the Chinese authorities.
And it's a horrendous message to deliver at the best of times. But where there's a murder taking place, that's really difficult to explain the circumstances, and it has to be done sensitively. What you don't want to have to do is do it on the telephone because you're losing that control. Then if you factor in that you're having to do it through an interpreter, it must have been a really difficult thing to manage.
It was a huge dilemma. You know, we didn't have any other options. There's a huge distance in terms of where they were, you know, pretty much the other side of the world. So if you bear in mind that now the inquiry's moved along, there might be bits of information that are leaking out. The last thing you want is them to find out that their son has died on social media.
Building up a timeline is hugely important to your murder inquiry, and there are going to be certain points that are going to be important. Probably the most important one is when the murder took place. How did you go about identifying when the murder took place, and were you successful in that?
Yeah, I think we're pretty successful. Big evidential lead came on the 5th of October. And what we had there was the CCTV was very strong and clear, and it showed Yang Lu moving from his home address, taking the Metrolink tram up to North Manchester. And the stop he got off was the Velo Park stop, which is quite close to the Manchester City training ground. And then what we saw was a really clear image of Yang Lu at the Velo Park station. And then you can see on a longer camera shot him moving across the local road, Ashley Road. And then you saw him meeting up with another person. Now, whilst you couldn't identify either of them because it was a long shot, you could say that it certainly matched the description of Ming Jiang. And then they headed in the direction of his flat. That was the last time he was ever seen.
So importantly, you're now building up a picture of the last movements of Yang Lu. What does Yang's phone data show, or what is that telling you?
When we looked before the 5th and after the 5th, particularly around the phones, you got the before period was very different. So you got them occasionally talking to each other, but, you know, doing their own things. But then afterwards, you got the phones always together.
No CCTV is ever showing him leaving the flat. But his phone does.
The only person we're seeing is Ming Jiang. So it's a clear indication that Jiang has taken possession of those phones.
This is now an indication of when he's likely to have died, isn't it?
You could probably break your timeline down from around about 5 o'clock on the 5th to around about midnight on that same day.
Between the 5th and the 9th of October, Jiang dismembered the body and attempted to clean up the apartment.
On the critical date of the 9th of October, when the deposition took place, we found some CCTV at a local garage. We saw Ming Jiang turn up there, parked his car. He went into the kiosk and he actually bought a petrol canister. He then went out and he filled up that canister with petrol. The strong inference there is that he actually purchased the petrol early in the evening in order to set fire to Yang Lu's body. And in addition, we never seen anybody else. So we're not seeing a second offender. We're not seeing the mysterious John Wong that Ming Jiang has mentioned in an interview. There's just nobody else present. Again, it's really indicative that he's the only person responsible for that offence. Also, on the 10th of October, we discovered that there was a message sent on the WeChat platform from Yang Lu's phone to his mother, and that text message say, "I OK." It was clear that that message was sent in order to make sure that his family weren't getting suspicious about the fact that he wasn't in contact with them.
In this case, we were able to convince the Crown Prosecution Service that the evidence was there, and it was agreed that we would charge Zhang with murder.
We now had a very strong case, and ahead of the trial, we had also developed a clear idea of the motive.
In criminal trials, evidence can be put before a jury of a defendant's previous behaviour. This is known as bad character. Now, this can only be used in instances where that behaviour is relevant to the charge in which they face. Although it's not always straightforward, because the defence can make objections and ask for it not to be put in front of a jury.
So inquiries were done into the background of Ming Zhang, and whilst he wasn't well known to the police, there were a number of interesting issues in his background. There was an indication that he committed fraud in another country, and the other particularly interesting thing was around anger management. And he'd worked for a company where he was suspended and required to go on an anger management course because of his behaviour.
As you're building up your timeline of evidence, one strand that you will be looking at is financial. So today, most of us use our phones or credit cards or debit cards when we're making transactions. And these leave a footprint, a trail. What did the financial trail show you? What was happening?
The financial side of the inquiry was really, really productive, and it really helped us understand what had taken place. So there was quite a contrast between the two individuals. Yang Lu was a successful financial marketeer, and he lived in his own flat in a nice area of Salford and Media City. Whereas Ming Zhang was quite the opposite. He had a scruffy one-bedroom flat. He owed money on that. He was defaulting in terms of the payments to landlord. And he also had big gambling debts, very, very substantial gambling debts. After the murder had taken place, we established that Ming Zhang was responsible for adopting the identity of Yang Lu and essentially removing as many assets as he could from his financial accounts. And when you bear in mind that he had his passport with him when he was arrested, that probably was being used as an identity document.
We also found that he'd also tried to begin the process of selling Yang Lu's apartment.
So we looked in detail at the CCTV after the 5th, and what we saw repeatedly, day after day, was Ming Zhang turning up and going in and out of the flat. So Ming Zhang would go into the premises and essentially strip it of all the valuable items, including Yang Lu's clothes. On some occasions, he took suitcases either in or out of the flat. We established that there'd been a transfer of those suitcases back to China.
If Zhang was planning to flee the country, it just reiterates the importance of getting that arrest in at the earliest possible opportunity. If he would have been allowed to leave the country, we may never have found him again.
As a murder investigator, motive is important in one way and less important in another. It's important because it can give you an indication of why someone was murdered. It's less important because you don't actually have to prove motive, do you, when you're investigating a murder?
Yeah, that's right. Because I suppose from a jury point of view and going down the line, it's the why, isn't it? So why did this happen? And if you've got motive, then it really helps the jury to understand the motivations for why he did what he did.
What were the details of that?
Clearly, the issue of gambling led us to the casino. So we did inquiries with them, and what we established was there was a very interesting change in patterns. So pre the 5th of October, we have small amounts of money being spent by Ming Zhang at the casino, and then suddenly after the 5th, we're getting huge amounts. So there was an exponential increase in the amount of money that Ming Zhang was spending at the casino. We were looking at over £100,000 worth of expenditure that had been done at the casino after the 5th. Ming Zhang obviously was in a position where he was penniless. He had a severe gambling habit, and that was clearly his motivation for committing this murder. One of the really unpleasant things around this was, if you bear in mind that we've got the body disposed of on the 9th, when he gets back to the flat after that, the first thing he does, almost within the hour, is go to the casino in Manchester.
It just goes to show what a callous, evil individual this is, that he will put his own needs and his own gambling addiction and his own desire to go and spend money over the life of another human being who'd done absolutely nothing wrong.
From what I can hear, from what you're telling me, some fantastic police work has led you to a point where you, as a murder investigation team, you have the right person and you understand why this murder happened and the circumstances around it. Now it's a trial. And in many ways, it's completely out of your hands. How did you feel personally?
Well, I've got to say, once we got to that point, I was really confident. It's kind of a huge amount of circumstantial evidence, which, when you put it together, it's really strong.
No matter how strong you believe your case is, no matter how sure you are which way a jury are going to go, you're experienced enough to know that it might not always go the way you expect. So on the count of murder, do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty? What did they say?
On the 28th of April 2017, the jury found him guilty of Yang Lu's murder. And I kept my eyes on him because I wanted to see his reaction. It was really interesting to see, and it had absolutely zero impact on him. It was so unusual to see someone just be completely and utterly emotionless in those circumstances.
When somebody is found guilty of murder, there is only one sentence that they will be passed. It will be one of life imprisonment. What sentence did the judge in this case pass on Zhang?
So the judge, Judge Potter, sentenced Ming Zhang to life imprisonment with a minimum of 33 years. That's one of the highest sentences that you can be given.
The judge also said that Zhang's actions demonstrated that he was a highly dangerous, cunning and ruthless killer who was prepared to stop at nothing to fulfill his own selfish desire to feed his gambling habit, and that he killed a gentle young man. Zhang refused to come into court to hear his sentence, but it just speaks of what type of individual this is. He still won't be accountable for his actions. He still won't take responsibility.
A hugely important element to this investigation is the fact that the family would want to reconcile this whole body for a funeral, etc. What steps were you taking in order to try and facilitate that?
There were inquiries we did in various places, but we were just simply unable to establish a location. The reality is we had no real starting point in order to look for the rest of the body parts. The person that could have told us is Ming Zhang, and so far he has remained completely silent. This offence has had a devastating impact on the family. It's hard to imagine what they've gone through. I know, having met them on a number of occasions, that they're completely and utterly devastated. They describe about having memories of him and also the tears that they shed almost daily. It's not just about the fact that their son was murdered, but it was the inhumane way his body was treated after that offence. The extent of the inhumanity and the way that he treated his friend, Yang Lu, was quite incredible, really.
When I look back at this case, it was one of the most difficult ones that I'd dealt with. I don't think I'd ever been in a position where I'd had so many lines of inquiry that hadn't worked out. So there's a real sense of pride for me personally and for the team in getting success out of this, and it's a case that I'll never forget.
From me looking on the outside in, I can see how good an investigation you did, and you did that for a number of people. You did that for Yang Lu, and you did that for their family. And on their behalf, I would just like to say, Terry, thank you for the work you and your team did.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that.
It never ceased to amaze me how quickly an investigation can change. 1 minute you're standing there thinking, how are we going to solve this case? Then very quickly, by one small piece of evidence, everything can change. And that's what I see in this case. What it also does for me is to show the absolute determination of murder detectives. They were determined to get justice for Yang Lu, and that's exactly what they did.